Politics is a game of power. It's not about what is right or wrong. And Donald Trump is showing us exactly that. For years, America's dominance has been slipping, especially with the rapid rise of China as a global superpower. China now produces more manufactured goods than any other country in the world. It controls nearly 30% of global manufacturing, more than the United States, Japan, and Germany combined. Now, Venezuela's problem is not dope dealing, but its close ties to China and Russia, right in America's backyard. After recent developments in Venezuela, the world has entered a more hostile phase. The United States appears tired of using diplomacy to force cooperation, especially from its enemies. Instead, it's turning to brute force, ignoring the outcry from the international community. Now, in this video, I'll break down the countries on Trump's hit list and explain why many critics believe the real enemy he's fighting are Russia and China, both seen as threats to America's position as the world's leading superpower. I'll also explore how the Trump administration manipulates global markets using tariffs, sanctions, and explosive public statements. Now, these tactics disrupt economies, punish countries and organizations that oppose America's policies, and redirects wealth towards American companies and their allies. The formation of BRICS is another growing threat to the United States as the world's dominant power, especially its plan to create an alternative currency for international trade outside of the US dollar. Today, most global trade, especially key commodities like oil and metal, is priced in US dollars. This gives America enormous financial power, including the ability to impose devastating sanctions. Now, countries like Russia and China want to break free from these systems. They want protection from sanctions and less dependence on the dollar. If oil is ever widely sold in a currency other than the dollar, America could slowly begin to lose its grip as a global superpower. Oil is the most traded commodity in the world. Because it is sold in US dollars, every country that buys oil must first get dollars. Now, this creates constant global demand for the dollar, and it keeps its value strong. Now, countries stockpile in dollars as reserves to pay for oil and other imports. Now, this system allows the US government to borrow money cheaply from itself eventually, because the world wants to hold dollars and US debt. Now, in simple terms, other countries are indirectly funding America's spending. Now, Trump and the United States appear to be pushing towards a new world order, one where America remains on top and Trump places himself at the center of power, and Israel plays a strategic role in that vision. Now, Hugo Chavez rose to power by tapping into the anger and frustration of the poor. He promised to share Venezuela's oil wealth more fairly and claimed that the political elite and American oil companies were stealing the country's resources for themselves. Now, after becoming the president, Chavez launched social programs and grants to help the poor. But behind the scenes, corruption and poor management continued to grow. He nationalized the oil industry and forced out American companies. While this gave the state more control, it also led to failing oil production due to mismanagement and lack of investment. Now, over time, US sanctions and declining oil revenues made it harder for Venezuela to fund these social programs. Now, the economy slowly collapsed. Chavez also cracked down on opposition, firing, imprisoning, or silencing critics who challenged his rule. Now, before his death, Chavez handpicked Nicolas Maduro as his successor. Today, oil is not the only issue in Venezuela. What Trump is doing there is also about keeping America's rivals, Russia, China, and Iran, out of his backyard. Once the United States began punishing Venezuela over oil and politics, the country was forced to look elsewhere for support, and who better to turn to than America's biggest enemies. Now Venezuela began aligning itself with Russia, China, and Iran, countries openly opposed to US power. In many ways, Trump is responding the same way Putin did with Ukraine, except Russia didn't kidnap Ukraine's president. But basically, the oil in Venezuela was now going to China, and America was not happy about that. Over the past 2 decades, especially under Chavez and Maduro, Venezuela has built deep political and economic ties with Russia, China, and Iran. These relationships are driven by oil deals, military cooperation, and a shared resistance to US influence. But here's the real problem for Washington. Venezuela is right next door, and the United States does not want Russia or China gaining a foothold so close to home. What Donald Trump and the US government more broadly does not want is Russia or China setting up military bases or missile launch sites in Venezuela that could directly threaten the United States. Now this fear is deeply rooted in history. What happened was, in 1962, the world came dangerously close to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The then US President John F. Kennedy discovered, or he was suspecting, that Cuba had allowed the Soviet Union to place nuclear missiles on its soil, just 150 kilometers from the US coast. Now those missiles, they claimed, were aimed at American cities and were seen as an unacceptable threat to national security. Now, because of that experience, the United States treats any hostile foreign power placing any advanced weapons systems in the Western Hemisphere, especially near its borders, as a red line. From Washington's point of view, Russia or Chinese missile facilities in Venezuela would be a modern version of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it would almost certainly trigger harsh US response. A similar power struggle is playing out in Greenland. You see, Greenland is not an independent country, but a self-governing territory within the Kingdom of Denmark. It has its own government and parliament and also controls most domestic matters like health, education, and natural resources. Denmark, however, still handles foreign affairs, defense, and monetary policies for them. Now, Greenland's real importance lies in its location. It sits between North America and Europe in the Arctic, making it a strategic military advantage. It is an ideal position for early warning radar systems and missile defense. Now, the United States considers Greenland a key part of its defense network, helping it detect missiles or nuclear attacks, especially those coming from Russia. So basically, whoever controls Greenland and its surrounding waters can monitor major trade routes between Asia, Europe, and North America and position military assets closer to Russia. Now today, Russia is expanding its Arctic military bases and icebreaker fleet, while China has also established a presence in parts of Greenland through research and economic projects. Now, in simple terms, the United States does not want Russia or China anywhere near its borders. It is not about friendship, it's about power. And at its core, it's a modern Cold War. Iran, besides being sworn enemies to Israel, it sits at the heart of the Middle East, right next to some of the most important routes on earth. It borders the Persian Gulf and controls access near the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow passage where nearly 20% of the world's oil flows through. Any instability in this area can send oil prices soaring, disrupting global trade and put US allies at risk. That is why the United States is determined to make sure no hostile power controls this choke point. One of Trump's main goals was to stop Iran from ever developing nuclear weapons. Iran openly challenges US influence by opposing American military presence in the region, aligning itself with Russia and China, and trying to build a regional power bloc that operates outside of US control. Now, Trump's strategy was simple but aggressive. Crush Iran economically so it could no longer fund militias, influence neighboring countries, and challenge American dominance. Now, Trump's reach did not stop in the Middle East. US carried out strikes in the northwestern regions of Nigeria, targeting the Islamic terrorist groups accused of killing Christians. Now, in reality, these groups terrorize everyone, Muslims and Christians alike. Ironically, the areas affected are largely Muslim communities who themselves live under constant threat of these militants. Now, some critics argue that Trump's justification for Nigeria, like his stance on Venezuela, was not the full story. They believe the real objective was influence. Now, according to this view, Trump was positioning the US to gain access to the Sahel region. Many countries in the Sahel have been turning away from the West and moving closer to Russia and China. The West cannot afford to lose the Sahel. The region is rich in critical minerals and the global economy depends on it. And control over those resources could decide the balance of power in the future. Under Trump, and even more so after him, the United States views the Sahel as a new battleground for global power. Russia, through the Wagner Group, moved into countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, offering security in exchange for mineral access and political loyalty. Now, China took a different approach. Instead of troops, it poured money into infrastructure, mining, and loans, quietly building influence through economies. Now, the Sahel and nearby regions are rich in critical resources, uranium, especially in Niger, gold, lithium, and rare earth minerals. Now, these resources are vital for energy security, nuclear power, and high-tech and defense industries. Now, in Trump's worldview, resources are strategic weapons, especially if America's rivals controls them. Trump also understood how sensitive financial markets are. When he announced or even threatened tariffs, investors reacted instantly. Stocks linked to manufacturing, agriculture, automobiles, technology, and global supply chains could rise or crash within hours. For example, if he threatens tariffs on China, the technology stocks falls. You see, Trump uses tariffs as leverage, fully aware that markets would respond fast and violently. Basically, in the stock market, Trump can tell these people to place their money on certain stocks before he makes the announcement, knowing that the markets are going to shift to their advantage. And then as soon as he makes the market, then they already cashing in. And when everybody else reacts after, it's already late. They are the first movers when it comes to the stock market. Sanctions work the same way. They don't just punish countries, they redirect money. When the US sanctions a nation, its companies are cut off from dollar financing, global investors pull out, and competitors, often American firms, step in to benefit. For example, if he sanctions Iran, then oil prices, especially US energy stock, it goes up. If he sanctions Russia, then European energy prices surge. Some US companies and European companies, they benefit. You see, markets don't move on morality. They move on access, who is locked out and who takes their place. I believe Trump is making a calculated money play with all these global crises. He is strategically positioning his allies in the business world to profit from the chaos he helps create, especially those tied to the oil industry and military-industrial complex, where weapons and war tools are sold for massive gain. You see, this doesn't stop at bombs and missiles only. Wars destroy countries, and the same networks of powerful friends, owners of major construction and engineering companies, they step in and rebuild these countries. Now, the aid that is supposedly sent to help these nations often end up flowing straight back to those companies through lucrative contracts. Now, as I said from the beginning, politics is not about right or wrong. It's about power and leverage. And Donald Trump is using his position to the fullest, making the most of it while he's still at the top.